Waiting. Waiting is not an easy task, yet it's something we all experience. Waiting is that painful stretch of time that links the way things were with the way things will be. In the journey of life, we often find ourselves waiting. Waiting for rescue, waiting for answers, waiting for love, waiting for change, waiting for happiness, waiting for a better life. Most of the time, we find ourselves waiting, wanting, and longing for good news. We're waiting for something significant to happen. We're wanting something to come and change our lives. We're longing for our stories to be rewritten. We're waiting for someone to come and sweep us off our feet, wanting that medical miracle to heal our bodies, longing for Ed McMahon to show up with that large check to eliminate all our financial concerns. This week, I found myself waiting, sitting in a room designed for such a task. The waiting room can be one of the most exhausting places in the world, surrounded by old magazines and anxious people who are trying to distract themselves by reading a book, looking at their phone, or watching TV. The waiting room is where I tried to piece together this morning's sermon as we waited to see how effective Henry's treatment has been. And in the midst of waiting, we often find ourselves stuck between reality as it is and reality as we hope it will become. Stuck in a situation that we are longing to escape from. Stuck waiting in uncertainty, desperately looking for answers. Stuck wanting something that we don't know will ever happen. Stuck longing for something different, something new, something better. We've all sung songs of waiting. These songs are often sandwiched between the songs of lament for the way things are and the songs of rejoicing for the ways they will become. The songs of waiting get played over and over again. In that painful stretch of time that links the way things were with the way things will be. And so we join our voices often with that mystic Tom Petty, who sings, "The waiting is the hardest part. You take it on faith, you take it to heart. The waiting is the hardest part." For several months, we've been traveling with the people of God as they make their way to the temple, as they journey on the road of life. They sing the songs of ascent, these 15 songs that lead them to the house of the Lord. And these psalms are a soundtrack for their road trip. It's a hymnal for their travels. And each of these songs play a significant role in their worship of God. They're songs of endurance and songs of meaning, songs of trust and help and peace and hope and joy. And these songs unite them as they celebrate God's faithfulness towards his people. So today, we're joining with the people of God from generation to generation as we lift our voices to sing Psalm 130, the song of waiting. And the song begins with a cry of desperation. It says, "Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help." And it leads us then to eventually to a place of celebration where we put our hope in the Lord, for there's faithful love with the Lord. But the central theme, as we look at the middle of the psalm, we find the central theme that lies between our cries and our celebration during that painful stretch of time that links the ways things were with the ways they will be. Psalm 130 is a song of waiting, and it challenges us to wait for the Lord and put our hope in his word. 3 times in 2 sentences, the waiting psalmist sings those words, "I wait." And when he sings those, he's reminding us that waiting is the hardest part. You take it on faith, you take it to heart. Waiting is the hardest part. Psalm 130 is a song for everyone who waits. As we join in singing the song of ascent, we lift our voices to those who have found themselves waiting, wanting, and longing. A song dedicated to those who are in that stretch of time that links the way things were to the way things will be. And when we sing the song of waiting, we discover that we're not really waiting for our circumstances to change, but we're waiting for our perspective to shift from our circumstances to the Lord. Now, if you take a quick glance at this, if you look at the back of your bulletin, you'll see our psalm, and you'll discover one of the most repeated words in this psalm is the word Lord. So if you got a pencil or a pen, go ahead and circle every time you see the word Lord there. All right, as you see, how many times do we see the word Lord? First one wins a prize. You can have a copy of this CD. 8. There we go. Get yourself a prize. All right. So it shows up 8 times. And then if you look through the psalm, you'll see that God is also referencing like words like you or your, he, him, his. If you circle those times, how many times do you see that? It should be about another 8 times. So 16 times in 8 verses, the waiting psalmist makes it clear that we're not waiting for the world to change or our circumstances to get better, but we're waiting for the Lord. Now, next I want you to notice that there's something interesting going on. You might look at the word Lord in this text in your bulletin or in your Bible, and you might notice that there are 2 variations of the word Lord. Right? There's Lord with capital L and then the capital O-R-D, and then there's the Lord with just a capital L and a lowercase O-R-D. Now, this is not just someone thinking they're having a good time and they're maybe playing with the fonts. It's actually done purposefully because there's actually 2 distinct words being used. For most of our common English translations, when you see the Lord with an L, capital O-R-D, that all caps, that is actually the Hebrew word for God, his name, Yahweh. And you've heard that before. Perhaps you remember the scene in Exodus where Moses goes to the burning bush. And God is speaking to him through the burning bush, and Moses is kind of reluctant to go back to Egypt, and he's like, okay, God, but if I go and they ask me who sent me, who am I supposed to tell them? What should I say? What should I say your name is? And God replies, I am who I am. Or tell them, I am sent you. And so God is telling Moses that his name is I am. I am who I am. The Hebrew word Yahweh. And so we think means that God is the eternal God who has always existed and always will exist. And this is the name that the Hebrew people have found so holy that they refuse to even say it for fear of taking the Lord's name in vain. And so every time you see that listed as the L, capital O-R-D, in the Old Testament throughout your Bible, that is them referring to Yahweh. I am the eternal God who was and is to come. Now the second version of Lord that we see there is the capital L, lowercase O-R-D, is actually the Hebrew word Adonai. Adonai gets derived from this word sovereign. meaning that God is sovereign, or there's a sovereign leader. It was originally referred to someone who was like a master or a lord over people. They would be the Lord. And then the Jewish people, so as to not take the Lord's name in vain, they began to refer to God as Adonai. In fact, my family, we've been watching that series, The Chosen. And if you've watched that, they often will say, praise Adonai. They'll say something like that. Much like we would say, oh, thank God. So for them, that Adonai was just the common way they would refer to God. And so in this Song of Waiting, we'll see that Adonai and Yahweh are almost used, they're paired actually 3 times throughout the Scripture. All right? And so let's take a look. It says in verses 1 and 2, it says, I call to you, Lord, capital L-O-R-D. Lord, listen to my voice. In other words, I call to you, Lord Yahweh, the eternal God. Adonai, my sovereign master, listen to my voice. In verse 3, it says, Lord, if you kept account of iniquities, Lord, who could stand? Yahweh, eternal God, if you kept account of iniquities, Adonai, my sovereign master, who could stand? Or in verses 5 and 6, it kind of begins and ends with the phrase, I wait for the Lord. I wait for Yahweh, the eternal God. I wait for Adonai, my sovereign master. The waiting psalmist has come to understand that God, who is both eternal and sovereign, is what we are truly waiting for. We, who are bound by time and circumstance, find ourselves continually waiting for something. And this waiting can feel ambiguous and incomplete, never-ending, an arduous process. We never really find that satisfaction in our souls. This is because we are waiting for the wrong thing. We're waiting for things that are fleeting and unfulfilling. What Psalm 130 shows us is that we should be waiting for the Lord, the eternal, sovereign God who is faithful. He is faithful. He is faithful when we call to him in our despair. He is faithful when we confess our inadequacies and our iniquities. He is faithful for those who put their hope in him. So how then do we sing the song of waiting in our lives? What does it look like for the people of God to sing Psalm 130? As Eugene Peterson, he says that Psalm 130 grapples mightily with suffering, sings its way through it, and provides a usable experience for those who are committed to traveling the way of faith to God through Jesus Christ. The Song of Waiting doesn't sugarcoat our pain. It doesn't throw cliches that make us feel better. Singing the Song of Waiting walks us through our suffering and leads us to a place of hope. When we sing Psalm 130, we discover that the waiting for the Lord begins with our cries. Waiting for the Lord leads us to our confession. Waiting for the Lord moves us to our hope. As we lift our voices with those who are on the pilgrimage of faith and join in with the choir of God's people, we learn to wait on the Lord, the eternal, sovereign God, even though waiting is the hardest part. The song of waiting begins, out of the depths I call to you, Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ear be attentive to my cry. It's one of the things I love about these psalms. They don't sugarcoat our humanity. They don't sugarcoat our struggles. One of the things we've tried maybe get through kind of this idea that as Christians we shouldn't suffer or struggle, that we shouldn't embrace our pain, but it seems to be as a misconception. Perhaps you've heard cliches like God only helps those who help themselves, or God gives us only what we can handle. These things that suggest that God's maybe just in the business of dealing out some pain in order to test our threshold. But I don't think these ideas really aren't found in Scripture, because we look at the Scriptures and we see people placed in situations time and time again that they can't handle on their own. So they have to call out to God. We see over and over throughout the Bible hurting people who find themselves in desperate situations, crying out to the eternal sovereign God, looking for rescue, but are often found waiting. Psalm 130 shows us that waiting begins in a real place and not some trite cliche. Waiting for the Lord begins with our cries. The waiting psalmist has found himself in a desperate situation. We don't know the details of that. We don't know what's going on, but we can all resonate with that finding ourselves in this depth of despair and crying out to God. Even people who don't know God find themselves in that. I've been watching this TV show where these characters who aren't in a godly life, but they find themselves in a desperate situation. You see them crying out, praying to God. And you can think back the times in your life where you're caught waiting. I know there have been plenty of times in my life, in that painful stretch of time, thinking the way things were or the way they will become. The only thing you can do is cry out to God and wait for the Lord, the eternal sovereign master. And I know I'm not the only one who experiences anguish, waiting for something to happen in life. We've all faced sickness and financial struggle, heartaches and pain. We find ourselves wandering through that painful stretch of time, waiting, wanting, longing for something different, yet continually finding ourselves where that place where we hope we will be one day. So then what's the point of crying out to God? It feels like we're often waiting. There has to be a reason, a purpose for calling out to the eternal, sovereign God. And here's this, Charles Spurgeon says that it's better for our prayers to be heard than answered. It's better for us just to cry out to God. Or if the Lord were to make an absolute promise to answer our request, it might be rather a curse than a blessing. Makes me think of that movie, Bruce Almighty, where he was granting the request of everybody and just how chaos ensued. But there is something about coming to God and just bringing our tears and our pain and crying out to Him. And the waiting psalmist knows that we need to cry out to God, because calling out in prayer helps us make it through the waiting process. Because waiting is the hardest part. When we find ourselves waiting and calling out to the eternal sovereign God, our cries lead to confession. The waiting psalmist sings, Lord, Yahweh, eternal God, if you kept an account of our iniquities, Lord, Adonai, my sovereign master, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you may be revered. When we come to wait on the Lord, it leads us to confession. Now, when I say confession, I'm not saying that all this waiting that we're facing is always just a result of our sin, a consequence for some of the awful things that we've done. That you've done something evil and you must be punished for it, and that's why you're waiting. Now, it's true that our actions have consequences. Our mistakes can lead us to times of despair. Despair can lead us to confession. It's true that the account of our iniquities is so overwhelming. It's a wonder that any of us can truly stand. And perhaps you've done things, you find yourself done things that lead you to waiting, that you've allowed your sinfulness to rule your life, and now you're facing the results of those choices. The good news is that no matter what you've done, that there is forgiveness and redemption in abundance. If that's the case, then the waiting psalmist invites you to offer your iniquities, to confess to the eternal, sovereign God, where you will find redemption in abundance. But that's not always true. Sometimes we find ourselves waiting through no fault of our own. We find ourselves unemployed because of corporate downsizing, visiting doctors because of a biological anomaly, or find ourselves in a broken relationship because of someone else's selfishness. So then what does that mean that our waiting leads to confession? When we're found waiting in these moments, we need to confess our desire for control. We need to confess that we are not God, and to surrender our situation into the hand of the eternal, sovereign God. Over the past few months, I know I've been struggling with the question of what's next when we are talking about our son's treatment. When he was first diagnosed years ago, they gave us this clear roadmap of one stage to the next to get us through this. But now this current treatment's been kind of, trying different things, wait and see. And so over the past few months, we've been wondering, okay, after this treatment we've gone through in Boston, what's next? I kept trying to bug the doctors to answer that question. So they want us, we waited, even this week, they said, wait for these scans of this past week, and so we waited, and we still don't know. We come to just we have to wait till his doctor's appointment on Thursday. Maybe we'll have some more answers. And during this whole process, I've been wanting to steer that, to guide things so I knew how to handle the situation. And so I have to confess my need for control over and over again. And if you're like me, control and surrender are difficult. I want to take control of the situations, to work things out according to my plan. Because waiting is the hardest part. So we fill our time trying to fix situations. But oftentimes those fixes that we attempt make the waiting harder. Manipulating situations, hoping to shorten that stretch of time between the way things were and the way things will be. We desire control to bring clarity to our pain. And so in the midst of waiting, we have to confess. When we sing the song of waiting, we're led to surrender control to God. Confession relinquishes our grasp and gives control back to Yahweh, Adonai, the eternal, sovereign God, who's at work in our waiting. Our crying leads us to confession so that we can be moved to put our hope in the Lord. The waiting psalmist sings, Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for there is faithful love with him, and with him is redemption in abundance. Our waiting begins with our calling out to God, and it leads to us crying for rescue. Finally, it leads us to putting our hope in him. The song of waiting concludes with that beautiful promise that those who put their hope in him and not in their circumstances or their abilities, but in Yahweh, the eternal God. When we sing the song of waiting, we join with God's people and proclaim to those who are waiting that there is faithful love with the Lord, with him redemption in abundance, and he will redeem Israel from all its iniquities. In the weeks ahead, as we journey into the next Psalm of Ascent, Psalm 131, it echoes the cry of Psalm 130. And this Psalm 131 concludes with this. It says, Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and always. The psalmist is reminding us that we need to continually put our hope in the Lord, not a one-time event, but a constant surrendering of control into the hands of the eternal sovereign God. I love the Message translation's version of this last verse. It says, wait with hope. Hope now, hope always. When you find yourself in that painful stretch of time that links the way things were with the way they'll be, wait. Cry out, confess, hope. Put your hope in the Lord. Hope now, hope later. Continue to put your hope in the Lord. Peterson writes that hope is based on the conviction that God is actively involved in his creation and vigorously at work in redemption. The song of waiting speaks to our hearts, reminding us that there is a God who is faithfully and lovingly active in our world, and is at work in the ways that we don't see or understand. As John Stott tells us, he says that waiting in hope is having a balance of waiting eagerly with keen expectation and waiting patiently with steadfast endurance of our trials. That's hard. Doing either one of those is hard, but somehow we wait with an excitement of what God is going to be doing, but also waiting patiently, knowing that it's not done yet. The waiting psalmist helps us by giving us this imagery of a watchman. He says, I wait for the Lord, the eternal sovereign God, more than a watchman for the morning. The watchman has a job to do, to keep a keen eye out for any danger that might try to overtake them. The night is filled with risk and shrouded in darkness. When we're in that stretch of time, that darkness wants to overtake us. We need to watch out for danger, but wait for the daylight. It's in that stretch of time that we must hope. Wait and hope for the Lord, whose faithful love brings us redemption and abundance. The waiting psalmist has crafted a beautiful song for those of us who have been found longing for something. Those who are at the end of themselves, awaiting the eternal, sovereign God to step into their lives and bring about change. And for those of us who are stuck in the middle between the way things were and the way things will be, we sing Psalm 130. We join with those whose voices are journeying into the house of the Lord, waiting for the eternal, sovereign God. We cry out to Yahweh Adonai, confessing our humanity and embracing God's boundless grace. It brings us hope in the Lord. Out of the depths I call to you, Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help. Lord, if you kept an account of iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you may be revered. I wait for the Lord. I wait and put my hope in his word. I wait for the Lord, more than the watchman for the morning, more than the watchman for the morning. Israel, put your hope in the Lord. There is faithful love with the Lord. With him is redemption in abundance, and he will redeem Israel from all its iniquities. We're all on this pilgrimage, and yet we find ourselves waiting. Each of us has things in our hearts that are making us feel stuck, challenges, difficulties, pains, and uncertainties. So this morning, I want to give us just an opportunity. Valerie's going to come up and she's going to just play for a little while. I'm going to give you a chance to pray, to call out to God, with your struggles, to confess your need for control, to ask Him so that you can put your hope in Him. So we're just going to take a few minutes. You can pray by yourself. You can join with others. You can pray out loud. You can pray in the silence of your heart. We'll just take a few minutes and just some time to pray. We can put our hope in the Lord.